In today's Formula One world, there is perhaps no other driver that is more controversial than Australian racer Daniel Ricciardo. He's known for having an aggressive style and, at times, a hot temper. But what are some of the moments he's most well known for? Stay tuned, because today we're looking at some of the most controversial moments of Daniel Ricciardo's career. So, what are some of the most controversial moments in Daniel's career? Let's have a look. Recently, Daniel found himself in hot water after making comments about some of the content being posted on Formula One's social media account. Ricciardo was doing an interview with Square Mile, a magazine that is published out of the United Kingdom. The beef between Ricciardo and Formula One began the previous year during a Grand Prix race in Bahrain after a horrific crash involving Romain Grosjean of the Haas F1 racing team. At the end of every season, Formula One puts together a highlights reel and shares it on various social media platforms. But when Daniel saw the 2020 season highlights video, he became infuriated when he saw crash replays of the Romain Grosjean incident. When speaking about Formula One executives, Daniel had this to say: "I was just like, you guys are effing idiots. Maybe 12-year-old kids want to see that kind of content, and that's cool because they don't know any better, but we're not kids. Just do better, guys. Do better than that." Understandably, there was some backlash to Daniel's comments, and he later said that he probably should have chosen his words more carefully. During a press conference at Emilia-Romagna GP, Daniel said, "I certainly got to be better with my choice of words. Certainly if I could, let's say take that quote back, I would. It was too aggressive. I should know that, being in the sport as long as I have." So ultimately, what was the fallout of the social media post fiasco? Let's find out. In the end, despite admitting that he probably should have chosen his words more carefully, Daniel's position regarding the 2020 season social media highlight reel hasn't changed. In subsequent interviews with the press, Daniel did his best to clarify his comments and his anger so that people could better understand where he was coming from. Daniel had this to say: "I felt last year was such an amazing year for F1. There were so many different podium getters. There were a lot of exciting races. I certainly wouldn't put it under a boring season, and I felt like there was probably more room to expose the highs of the sport and the great achievements of a lot of individual drivers, individual performances. I felt like there were better stories to be told as opposed to just crashes. I feel like we're better than just showing crashes." And for those of you unfamiliar with the Romain Grosjean crash that Daniel was referring to, it was a 225 km/h crash that happened last year in Bahrain. Amazingly, the crash happened on the very first lap of the race. Grosjean's car lost control, struck a barrier, and essentially exploded like a bomb with a big fireball. Everyone on the track and in the pits became extremely concerned, agitated, and many feared that Grosjean had been killed instantly. After the crash, Daniel expressed his disgust at broadcasters for not cutting away from the fiery and potentially fatal crash. Daniel scolded Formula One and told members of the press, "I want to express my disgust and disappointment with Formula One. The way the incident of Grosjean was broadcast over and over, the replays over and over, it was completely disrespectful and inconsiderate for his family, for all of our families watching." So what were things like for Daniel when he first entered the Formula One world? Let's have a look. The 32-year-old hotshot Aussie race car driver burst onto the F1 scene back in 2011 at the age of 22. Since then, throughout his career, he has experienced several victories and some hard-fought defeats. So let's look at some of the most wild moments in Daniel's career, starting in 2012, where Grosjean had his fiery crash, Bahrain. In 2011, Daniel spent much of his time racing in the back, far from lead positions. But after spending approximately half a season with the now-defunct Spanish racing team HRT, Daniel Ricciardo started building a reputation for himself as a driver with the Red Bull racing team before moving up to Toro Rosso and making his full-time debut in F1. But Daniel's F1 debut in Bahrain wasn't smooth like a freshly paved track. In fact, it was more like a bumpy, unfinished road. Despite qualifying well for the Bahrain Grand Prix and starting the race up front, Daniel basically blew it right on lap 1. By the time the first lap of the race was over, Daniel had fallen to 11th place and bumped into a Caterham driven by Heikki Kovalainen. Daniel had to pit for a new front wing, and as a result, finished the race in 15th place. Talk about a total bummer. After the Bahrain Grand Prix, Daniel had this to say to the press: "Bahrain was painful. Saturday, amazing. Qualified 6th in a Toro Rosso. Everyone was talking about what I'd done, and then I just got absolutely mauled 24 hours later. I knew I had the speed at the time, but I was yet with the right mindset to race at the front, get my elbows out, believe I belong there yet. I guess we found out, right?" Stay tuned and don't go away, folks, because we've got more adrenaline-pumping F1 action on the way. Next up, an epic showdown in Japan. Despite Daniel's lousy start to the 2012 F1 season, the then-rookie driver fought and clawed his way back up the rankings like a Tasmanian devil, earning 5 top 10 finishes. In a race in Japan during the second half of the 2012 season, Daniel even managed to earn the respect of one of Formula One's most legendary drivers, 7-time World Championship racer Michael Schumacher, who really needs no introduction. During the Japanese Grand Prix, Daniel battled it out with Schumacher in an intense neck-and-neck finish and was able to secure a 10th place finish. After After the race, Daniel spoke to the press and had this to say about going head-to-head with one of F1's highest caliber racers. At Suzuka 2012, I had Michael Schumacher all over me for the last few laps and held him off for 10th. It was my first full year in F1, and I remember he came to me in the driver's briefing at the next race and complimented me for the way I defended. He didn't need to say that, so that was cool. Fast forward to 2014, and Daniel takes his first official Formula One win in Canada, but an ocean away at Germany's Hockenheim racetrack, a rivalry was brewing between Daniel and Fernando Alonso. Daniel made these comments to members of the press after the German Grand Prix. I felt like I hadn't earned Alonso's respect until that day. I still had a point to prove to him. He came out of the pits behind me on fresher tires and cruised past me on the straight, but he left the door open, probably not expecting me to try to repass, so I went for it. We had this cat and mouse game after that, and it was big to show him I was prepared to put up a fight on inferior tires while keeping it clean. He said some nice things about me afterwards, so I think he looked at me differently after that. So what happened in the second half of the 2014 season? Let's find out. After Germany, Daniel went on to win 2 additional races and showed tremendous skill at the Hungaroring. Daniel had this to say: "Pure joy. All that race, I just never felt like I was going to get beaten for whatever reason. I led a big part of the race but had to pass Fernando and Lewis Hamilton at the end, but I had a lot of confidence in myself and I just felt I was on it all day. It was a race to win that I took with both hands and a touch of arrogance. Haha. The emotions that day were super powerful." The touch of arrogance comment refers to Daniel's comment. That's how you do it, ladies. After he took the lead in the race, jump ahead 2 years to 2016 and Formula One gets its first glimpse of Daniel's temper at the Monaco Grand Prix. Daniel took the pole in a wet and dry race and was sure that a win was imminent, but when he decided to make a pit stop, his Red Bull pit crew didn't have the proper tires ready and he was in the pit for a very long time. Because of the foul up, Daniel lost his lead position and then the race to Lewis Hamilton in his Mercedes. After the race, Daniel was furious. Later in an interview, Daniel had this to say about the screw up in the pit. "Even 4 years on, I remember this day in so much detail. I can picture myself driving through the corner before the tunnel after that pit stop and I was so angry. I wouldn't have minded having a mechanical, so I didn't finish. I didn't want to talk to anyone afterwards. I certainly didn't want any sympathy. It was just pure rage. I remember standing on the podium with Lewis. I just didn't want to be there." That's a wrap for today's video, folks. We hope you enjoyed it, and make sure you subscribe to our channel because we've always got great videos on the way.